You're listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the news from the continent. My name is Nick Norbrook. Please head to theafricareport.com for more news, analysis and comment. We'll be ramping up our coverage of the coronavirus pandemic, as you can imagine. But there's already a great deal of material up there, from the economic impacts of the virus to an interview with Michael Yao of the WHO. My guest this week is Gyude Moore, Liberia's former Minister of Public Works. When the Ebola outbreak struck in 2014, Moore was the Deputy Chief of Staff to President Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf and had a front row seat as the administration battled the virus. He has precious advice for African policymakers about the need to use religious or traditional leaders who are trusted by communities to send messages, about the need to separate the healthcare system into outbreak management and everything else, and much, much more. When Gyude Moore heard about the coronavirus outbreak, it brought back memories.
Once it started in China, it was deja vu all again. And I think I was reasonably more frightened of it than most of my colleagues because of people around, because I think very few people have experienced something like this. One will hope that in a lifetime you get to experience this once, but it looks like for us who went through what happened in West Africa, this is the second go at it.
So walk us through what happened in those first few days and weeks of the Ebola crisis. And when did you realize this was something that was going to take up the whole of your time, 24/7, until it was finished?
So it escalated. So the first case for us was in March, I think, of 2014. And then that case and her contacts were traced. And we went for about a month with nothing. And then all of a sudden there was an explosion in the number of cases, right? So the number of cases began to go up, and then eventually there was this explosion in the number of cases. But the second part that actually helped us to see this was Médecins Sans Frontières was responding to the outbreak in Liberia because they had the experience from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And every time they kept coming back, because I was in the president's office at the time, and they would say to us, the next Ebola treatment unit we're going to build is going to be the largest ever built. And each one kept becoming the largest ever built. And at one point, they had a meeting with us and told us that as a private institution, as a private organization, as a non-profit organization, we have literally reached the limits of what is possible for us, what we can do. You are now going to have to turn to states to provide assistance for you to deal with this.
And tell us what followed in terms of the response to Ebola in Liberia.
I think once the severity of the situation became evident, then the government reorganized itself. So one of the first things that happened, and this will be very important for African countries who might have to deal with this or another pandemic in the future, was to separate the provision of regular health care services from the incident response. And what it did was, so the instead of the Minister of Health being responsible for leading the response, it was removed from the Minister of Health, and the Minister of Health was responsible to keep the health system functioning, but the incident management was handed over to, he was then an assistant minister at the Ministry of Health, but it was handed over to another person to be able to run that. The reason is, you do not want what's happened in Italy, what began to happen in Wuhan. That's what you're trying to avoid. You do not want the incidents to the outbreak, the pandemic, to overwhelm the regular health system, because then what happens is people begin to die from diseases and illnesses other than what's happening. So the first thing was that. The second thing was, it became clear that because there was no medicinal or no therapeutic solution to this, it was going to require behavior change. So as you can see now, we're talking about social distancing, but it wasn't simply social distancing. It was the hand washing, it was the avoiding of the fluids. So all of the things that individuals and groups are supposed to do to be able to break the transmission chain, that became important. And the importance of that was the central government had to take responsibility and give out a single standard message, because this is really, really important. Initially, there was reports that we weren't calling it fake news then, but that it was a hoax, right? People felt the government was manufacturing a crisis as a way of being able to attract donor funding, and the funding would then be siphoned off and stolen. And so it took a while for the message to actually get across. And initially, for social distancing, it was voluntary, but people ended up in nightclubs, people ended up at bars, people ended up doing the exact same things they had to do. And so the government had to enforce social distancing by declaring a curfew, shutting down non-essential work in the government, sending people home. I mean, obviously, there's a huge economic cost to that, especially for a country with few means of raising taxes and few means of being able to generate resources. But it was important to be able to stop the outbreak and break the transmission chain.
Specifically on hand washing, what did you find was the most effective way of communicating to the largest amount of the population the importance of hand washing and how to wash your hands and all these things?
One of the things we ended up using was a lot of media. So we got musicians who were already popular, making songs, and they made specific songs about Ebola and hand washing. And some of those songs were really catchy, and so people would listen to them. We had a large system of community radios with very limited content, and so they were prepared to play content that was developed for them, and so we used those community radios. But also it was important to be able to, because in some places the government itself was not as credible a purveyor of advice as it could have been. So in those instances with religious groups, we used the imams, we use pastors, we use bishops, we use traditional leaders. So it was a combination of social systems and social bureaucracies that existed outside of the government, but also using stars, local musicians, local stars who people liked and followed anyway, to get the message out. So it was a combination of that. I think on the front of behavior change and social distancing and hand washing, it's the communication aspect is really, really important, and it's never enough for the government alone to do it. What is important for the government to do is that the message that each of these groups is disseminating is singular and standard. It's the same message regardless of whether you're hearing it from the central government, from the provincial government, or from your local government. It was the same.
You say there was a catchy tune for hand washing. Can you remember it? Can you sing it for us?
I actually don't. I actually don't remember it. But there were a number of them, and people liked them. And some, I think, in some instances, it were basically an appropriation of existing songs, but they just did them for Ebola. I wish I had thought about it before our conversation, and I would have.
Although we were spared the dulcet tones of Gyude's singing, he did send us the name of the tune he was thinking about, Ebola is Real by F.A., Soulfresh and Deng. Here's a sample of the track.
Your hand was up and go When the party the plum don't eat it. When the monkey won't play, don't play with it. When someone are red and they sweating too much, please avoid them. You won't tell your friend them.
When it comes to Ebola, a lot of people say that Nigeria got something right. Is it possible to break down the Nigerian response?
So I think a part of it was Nigeria had done an extensive vaccination program, and Nigeria had also done responses to Lassa fever outbreaks. And so the Nigerian government was able to appropriate existing infrastructure for other things, say vaccination campaigns or the Lassa fever response. And so they were able to appropriate those that health infrastructure to the response. And they did really, really well with the contact tracing. And I think it was made easier for Nigeria because the person who came to Nigeria ill was a Liberian government official from the Ministry of Finance. So it was sort of easier to trace his contacts, who was on the plane with him, who drove him from the airport, where did he stay, what hospital did he go to. It was sort of easier to do that. Now, if the person had come to Nigeria through, say, a transport bus and had alighted in the general market in Lagos and then disappeared, I think it would have been significantly more difficult. So I think the way it happened in Nigeria also helped the process, but the Nigerian response was professional and competent. The question, though, is that because of that, Nigeria didn't face the onslaught that, say, Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone did. And so it is unclear how the system would have responded if they had 100 cases or 100 persons instead of one, if they had 200 instead of one. And so I don't think there's any system, any health system that is built to be able to accommodate the number that we saw. And that's why preparation is so important, so that you never get to a place where the number exceeds what the system can accommodate.
Given everything that has happened with Ebola, what do you think, what impact do you think that will have had on African governments as they start to prepare for the coronavirus?
There isn't a single country on the continent who didn't see what happened to the countries in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak, who didn't see the devastation to the economic and social life. And so most countries on the continent would have acted to avoid being in that position. And this isn't unusual. You saw that during the recent outbreak of the Ebola virus in Eastern Congo, all of their neighbors took similar actions to try to reduce the spread of the virus. So I think recognizing the impact, especially the economic and social impact that the Ebola virus had, most countries were very aggressive in terms of their preparation. And this is one of the lessons we learned from Ebola and applied to the coronavirus, that you want to over-prepare. Over-preparation means you don't have to overreact. And so I think most countries took that action, and that's the best thing. We saw in Uganda about that citizens from countries that have been affected by the coronavirus who refused to abide by Uganda's protocols of self-quarantine were sent back to their countries. So in places like Kenya, where schools have been closed, people are taking those steps, and eventually, like Dr. Anthony Fauci, the head of the NIH here in the US, says, you want to be criticized at the end of the outbreak for having overreacted, for having overprepared, for having done more than what's necessary. You don't want to be criticized for having done less. So I think for African countries that are doing that, this morning I saw that the Ministry of Transport, even in Liberia, had issued an advisory for matatus, what we call them buses in Liberia. But I think it's happening everywhere, and this is good. This is the kind of thing you want, because again, in most of the countries we're talking about, the health systems struggle to deliver regular health services. And in Nigeria, for example, they were just emerging from the largest Lassa fever outbreak. Most countries in sub-Saharan Africa bear the brunt of the malaria disease burden. So it's not as if these are systems that are free